thank you to the center for organizing this today and bringing us all together. I am going to turn right to the panelists, starting with Michelle, to give us a definition of terms. We're talking about media literacy, how to spot fake news. So let's define media literacy.
I think that's a great place to start. So namely defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. So in simplest terms, we're really looking at an expanded definition of literacy. So what does it mean to be literate in the 21st century? And we really need to understand how to read and write using all media and all forms of communication.
Do you feel like this is an idea, a focus that's getting more attention in recent years?
Before 2016, no one was returning my phone calls. So I would say absolutely. It has been an incredible time of exploration and enhancement in the media literacy community. It's actually just an incredible to witness how often we are having these conversations and how much incredible work is being done around the country in the media literacy space. It's really extraordinary.
And you're focused on media literacy every day, but there is an annual week coming up, Media Literacy Week. When is that?
Yes, so next week, October 26th to 30th, is the US Media Literacy Week. Canada also participates in Media Literacy Week. They actually launched it even before us. Australia does a Media Literacy Week, and it's also global. So media literacy is really, really going across the globe, and you can check out our whole site, medialiteracyweek.us, and there are a ton of events for free from everything from representation in the media to youth civic engagement. It's really going to be an extraordinary week. Thank you for mentioning it.
Shout out to Canada. So we're going to go to Jane next. She's based in Toronto. Here's what I want to do. I want to ask all of our panelists to tell the 60-second story about their career journey. And then I'll share mine as well to give some context to how to spot fake news. But let's start with you, Jane, on your career journey and how you've ended up in this spot covering disinformation for BuzzFeed.
I think how we ended up here is a question everybody's asking.
That's a more than 60-second question. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so I've been covering disinformation for about 4 years. And before that, I was a media critic actually at a startup in Canada called Canadaland. And I began covering disinformation in November 2016 because it was this interesting mesh of beats between media coverage and cybersecurity, which I was particularly interested in. And something that we've seen a lot over the years is that as the US became familiar with the problem of disinformation, that problem began getting addressed at a scale that hasn't really been seen before when other countries were targeted with disinformation. It wasn't created in 2016. And over the years, we've also seen a lot of professionalization of disinformation, which is something that we've covered a lot at BuzzFeed as well. So I don't know if that answers the question of how we ended up here, but it sort of feels like now it's the culmination of those 4 years and all the conversations we've been having.
And give us the quick misinformation versus disinformation definition, since I know some people watching understand the difference, others may not.
Right. So the way I remember it is disinformation is deliberate. Misinformation is accidental. So if your grandma, tells you to try a home remedy for a sore throat, that's probably just misinformation. She doesn't mean to mislead you. If a bad actor is telling you to share a malicious or hateful meme on social media, that's disinformation. That's deliberate false information.
Aimee, tell us about your career journey and how you ended up at First Draft, and also work into the answer, what is First Draft?
So First Draft trains journalists on how to identify, verify, and responsibly report on disinformation. We've been very busy since 2016, like a lot of the people on the panel, because people's awareness, not that it has, it has also escalated, but people's awareness has also increased. And so our phone has rang off the hook. So I have not followed a linear career path at all. I have followed my interest path, and I'm not afraid to try new things. So when the internet was new in 1995, when I came to New York, I was like, yeah, let's try this. They were also paying more at the time. But it was really hard to work within a newsroom that validated this as a legitimate medium. And I think that can be still true. And so it's really hard if you're young to give yourself that confidence to stick with it, even in the face of people saying, well, this is just a fad, it's going to go away. But I think what's helped me in my career is to stay curious and to constantly improve my skills. I have a colleague who said, oh, I'm always trying something new. And I was like, what about Snapchat? And he's like, well, that's for younger kids. I'm like, it's for you too. So don't ever age out of learning something new, because I think that's really helped in my career path.
But you're saying there's still a tendency sometimes among some bosses and some newsrooms to say, oh, the internet, that's a separate thing. That's not the same as real life. And that's still a problem, because increasingly the internet and virtual life is the same as real life.
Yeah, and it tends to be sometimes an age thing, that middle and upper managers are older and they just don't validate it. And if they don't validate it and resource for it, meaning put people on the ground for it, have their reporters do the training, it's a side note in some newsrooms. And that's really unfortunate, because social media and things that happen online permeate almost every beat at this point.
Totally. I'll tell you one newsroom that is taking virtual life very seriously, and that's NBC. And I say this as a CNN anchor who is jealous sometimes of what I see on NBC and MSNBC. Brandy, you're at NBC owning some of these topics and coverage areas. Tell us about what you focus on NBC and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I, along with my work partner, Ben Collins, we focus a lot on misinformation, disinformation, and the far right sort of media ecosphere. And I got into this beat. I was an middle school teacher, and then I got a degree in library information science, and then I became a librarian. I worked at colleges and public libraries teaching media literacy. And then I figured out that they had news libraries, and I was a news junkie. So I started to work at news libraries. I worked at ABC News and Fox News. And then I went to work at the Daily Beast because I wanted to write. And when I worked at the Daily Beast from 2013 to 2017, I did a lot of work on niche internet communities. So I did a lot in the pickup industry. My first article ever was Christians who spanked each other for Jesus. It was Christian BDSM. Anyway, all of which is to say is that I used to focus on these really weird niche communities online. And in 2016, the tiniest niches online, especially the misogynistic ones in the manosphere, suddenly became really politically relevant. We got Gamergate, we got people on the far right, like Mike Cernovich, suddenly became people who were important politically in America. And so that sort of made me a political reporter. And I do a lot of work with digital forensics, finding out who is behind a website, who is behind a secret account. And that also became politically really important with the rise of false news, junk websites, stuff like that. So now I'm at NBC News, one where you said they really do take it seriously, extremism and disinformation online. And I'm just so lucky.
I really respect that you all are taking it seriously. Not every news outlet is, and I think it's important that the NBCs and the CNNs of the world take these phenomena seriously. And what you said about becoming a political reporter resonates with me, because I feel like I've been thrust into that world much more than I was pre-Trump and pre-2016 as well. I'm muted because my 1-year-old is screaming, so I apologize to anybody who hears the baby. It's bath time here, so you might hear a little bit more of that, but I'm sure we can all relate in various ways. Michelle, your turn for your career journey. Tell us about Obviously you talked about what media literacy is, but what does the National Association for Media Literacy Education do, and how did you get there?
Great, thank you. So I actually started in television production. So the work of the Center for Communication is very close to my heart. I went to NYU Film School a lifetime ago and worked in children's television for about a decade. And over that decade, I really started to notice just a lot of questions that I had about kind of the consumer culture that kids were growing up in and how that might impact them. So I went back to NYU for my graduate degree to look at how media impact children and how media impact social change. And that is really what led me to media literacy. So I come at media literacy from a production perspective, thinking about how media is constructed, thinking about the choices that are made, whether it's an entertainment, a piece of content, or a news program, or a social media post, which has been really fascinating to kind of bridge the production space with the education space. So I started at Namely in 2012, and that was after teaching production for some time in the New York City public school system, where I was kind of, inserting media literacy lessons in production and in media making. And it's been a really incredible time at Namely. We started as an organization that did a biannual conference, and now, as was said already, we host Media Literacy Week. We still do a conference. We curate resources and research and materials for teachers from pre-K to 16. We host regional events. We have launched a national media alliance with 12 other major national teacher organizations this year. We're doing a research project on the impact of media literacy. So a lot of work being done by the organization, and I'm really grateful for the support of our community in that work. And really, we are really here to amplify the work of media literacy education and making sure that we are looking at ways to scale it in the US. There's incredible work being done, but it is by no means a national priority, and that's a really big problem, and we need to really work on that. And so we're working on that also.
I'm glad your phone's been ringing off the hook, at least in the last few years. That's a good sign. I'll share my career journey briefly. Blogger to the New York Times to CNN. I feel like everything before 2016 was just a warm up or practice or rehearsal. And then this time in 2016, literally this week in 2016, I was on CNN talking about fake news. And I feel a little guilty about this, because I was using this term fake news in a way that the president would soon weaponize. Now, it wasn't totally my fault, of course. Jane, one of your colleagues at BuzzFeed, Craig Silverman, was talking about fake news in 2014, 2015, and he was on to something really serious. He was on to this issue of actually made up stories designed to deceive people, spreading virally on Facebook and Twitter. Now, we have a lot of different flavors of that problem now, and it's much more pervasive now. But in 2016, it was obviously a huge issue in the run-up to the election. And I was on CNN talking about it. I feel like I was a newborn baby just learning how to cry. And now, maybe 4 years later, like I'm learning how to walk, but it's still, we are still in these early stages of this problem. And so since 2016, I've been trying to focus more about it on CNN, and that's what I do in the newsletter as well. But I think for me, when I say the words career journey, for me, this journey is about trying to figure out how do normal people who might not be on this Zoom conference interact with news, and how do they know what is true and what is not true? And I think that question is getting harder and harder for people to answer every single year, which is why I love the title of this is How to Spot Fake News. The president, of course, so November, the election happened, and then December, President-elect Trump started to use the term fake news. And then in January of 2017, he really used it as a weapon to redefine the term, exploit the term, redefine it as news he doesn't like. And now I try not to say fake news on TV because I don't want to confuse my definition with his definition. But for purposes of this call, let's talk about actually fake news, actually made up stories, as you defined it, Jane, disinformation that is deliberately false. So to the question that our panel is titled, How to Spot Fake News. what are the tips and techniques that all of you would share with our viewers, some of whom are heading into journalism, others maybe not, but what are the tips and techniques to spot fake news? Aimee, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely in our wheelhouse. This is the thing that we focus on the most with journalists and also with the public is I think we want to look at something that moves you strongly in one way or another. If you are if you're seeing something on Facebook or on Instagram and it makes you feel very strongly, laughing, anger, you want to share it, to really think about it. Have you heard about this story elsewhere? And then to check other sources, because you want to make sure that this is a consistent narrative and not just a piece of a narrative that somebody has used to try and get other people to share just based on that volatility of that.
And Jane, I really admire the way that BuzzFeed's been out in front on this for years now, trying to sort through the chaos. What do you tell people when they ask you how to spot fake news?
You know, it's a very difficult question because ultimately the techniques that we teach for spotting fake news rest with the individual, but it's a systemic issue. So for individuals, a lot of them have to go against their instincts and against their regular social media usage. This means being careful and pausing every single time they share a news article, which is very counterintuitive. This might seem basic, but actually reading the news article that you're sharing before you're sharing it is incredibly important. And also sort of realizing that whether you're a public person or not, you're responsible for the ecosystem that you've created around you online. So that's your friends, that's your family, that's your grandparents or your coworkers. So when you do share a piece of false information, correcting it and trying to right that wrong, I think also goes a long way.
Right, right. And what we're talking about, which is made up stories, these are one flavor of the information sewer that you cover. You have a new story today about a whole different version of this we can get into later. But it's important to recognize this information landscape is getting more and more polluted in different ways all the time. And I think when we say fake news, we're talking about something that is almost like the classic version of it, right? Am I right to say that, Brandy, that there's, there are more and more versions of these problems, content from bad faith actors, but this classic version of a story made up to trick you, it is still a pervasive problem. Is that right? Is that fair?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that like Jane was sort of getting at this too, but it's not just there are lots of different flavors of fake news, right? Like you have like the fake local news websites that are so prolific, but then you have like it's just such a profitable business model, especially when Donald Trump is the leader of the world right now. And so you are pretty destined to be successful if this is your business model right now. We're looking at, this site revolver.news right now, and it's, the new Drudge, but it's even worse somehow. And it's like, it's more fake. It's more hateful, and it's working. And so when we see, we're looking at the pizza gating of Hunter Biden, for example, and it's just like, it's the same narrative over and over and over, but with newer, worse websites peddling it. And I just think that, I have a very pessimistic outlook when it comes to the future of sites like this.
So you said Revolver News, and I remember the only time I've ever heard of that site is on Tucker Carlson's TV show. And he has 5 million viewers on Fox, and he's endorsed this website. So you're telling me it's this swamp, it's this hateful sewer, and I'm thinking, oh, well, I heard about it from the biggest star on cable news. And therein lies the problem. There are these connections between what we would describe as like popular television or popular media versus these more radical outlets.
Yeah, they need content. Fox News needs content. And as a former member of the brain room at Fox News, I know how they get that content. They get that content by looking, it used to be in 2013, it was Town Hall. And now Town Hall seems quaint, right? Red State seems
Mm.
quaint. Now we're pulling, Maria Bartiromo is pulling from Revolver News, who is, edited by a guy who was fired from the White House for being too close to white supremacists. So, and I know I'm alluding to a lot of stories that people probably on this call haven't really followed. But the main idea is that there is a disinformation cycle, which starts on 4chan or a place like Revolver News and ends up in the lectern of the White House or on Fox News, and it's sort of this. Again, Ben Collins, my colleague, calls it a human centipede of disinformation. And that's what we're working with. It's a really gross cycle of disinformation where people are feeding and being fed off of just this terrible stuff.
I tried to call it that in my book, and my editor thought it was just beyond the pale. So let's mainstream that, because it is the best image for what what this is.
I can't believe I just said that.
But you're right. I should have called you for my book. I didn't call you. You were a former Fox staffer. Look, I think what you said about this cycle of disinformation, this does get to how to spot fake news. This is, when we say how to spot fake news, that's exactly what we're talking about. Do you think that the Hunter Biden story of the past 7 days is an example of this cycle of disinformation, where it launches on the New York Post front page in print and then gets cycled around?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, it even came, weeks ago from we started hearing like rumblings of this from, a Chinese dissident on a YouTube channel linked to Steve Bannon, and that sort of fed into sort of these terrible news sites like revolver.news. And then that sort of fed up the chain. And then again, Maria Bartiromo was mentioning it on the air, sort of just asking questions. It's just the thing, we see it over and over and over again. We saw it with this most recent Hunter Biden stuff, and we've seen it for the past 4 years, and we will continue to see it.
Right.
Michelle, I'm wondering, yeah, go ahead.
Do you mind if I weigh in on that?
Yeah, please.
I was actually thinking so much about the Hunter Biden story today, because, the thing that's tricky from a media literacy perspective is, media are not binary, right? It's not all good or all bad. It's not completely fake or completely true a lot of the time. And so understanding and analyzing media literacy from a media literacy perspective is more than just simply this is fake and this is true. And and the Hunter Biden story, I think, is a good example of that, because what we want to do, all the things all the panelists are saying, and we want to think deeply about all the information we're consuming. But if we simply just spot fake news, then we kind of ignore, right? We say, oh, okay, this is fake. I don't need to pay attention to that. And the truth is that we need to pay attention to this Hunter Biden story because of the way it got mainstreamed, the way, it got told, the purpose of that story, like the analysis of how that disinformation got to us is part of being media literate. So making sure that after we kind of determine whether or not this is a valid, reliable story or not, there's still analysis that needs to be done, because that's also how we continue to hone our media literacy skills and make sure that we don't necessarily fall for stories like this, is to understand the motivation of the people and the reporter that posted that, on Rupert Murdoch's choice to put that in the post, so those are things that are really, really important. So I just encourage us to look at that level of analysis also, and not just simply okay, that was fake, I don't have to pay attention to it, or this is true. True stuff needs to be analyzed too. We need to be thinking deeply about all the information around us.
Oh, yeah, Aimee, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, just with the Hunter Biden stuff, if we're talking about topography, it's malinformation, or it's been verified as being true, which makes it malinformation. And we saw the same thing in 2016 with Hillary's emails. And I think in terms of the team who brought the Hunter Biden stuff to light, it's the same team who brought the Hillary Clinton, or through the channel of Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so I think, much of what drives content online is marketing terms, frankly, and it's terms that are consistent and used all the time. And so all all the right has to say is emails, and that is a triggering word for people, and they go right back to that whole narrative of 2016 of feeling hoodwinked one way or another. So it's very clever, and the right is far better at distilling their narrative and beating that same drum again and again and again. As Brandy said, on Fox News, they just go right back to those narratives, and it works really well for them because it's easy for people to keep up.
It's all about resentment. It's about grievance. Brandy, do you agree that the right is more effective at that than others?
Oh, the left has no like they don't stand a chance. Like the right is so good at really getting their base fired up with just news and information, whether that's correct or not. And I think that they have some really, I mean, from OANN to the Gateway Pundit to, I mean, Fox News, you can sort of pick your poison when it comes to the spectrum of disinformation that you're comfortable with, and whatever level that is, there is a news outlet for you. And I think that, to Michelle's point, I think part of media literacy that I think is so important is, from a reporter stance, like what we want to always do is sort of show how the sausage is made. So if it's the Epoch Times, right, we want to show you who the Epoch Times is, why you're getting a newspaper on your door in Kansas, and what they're trying to sell you and who's profiting off of it. And I think that sort of story helps solve a mystery that's like, okay, this is fake, but why is it fake? Like, why would somebody tell me that? And I think that with just sort of a literacy of far right news outlets and being able to identify and say, oh, okay, I understand what this person's about. Craig has done a great piece on now I'm forgetting the guy, but the Patriot guy who won that award. Anyway, Jane would know. But like breaking down like who these people are, anonymous or known, and like what they believe and how they're profiting off of scaring the bejesus out of you and making you really angry is really, really important.
Right, pressing those fear buttons, and why are they doing it, and how are they doing it? Jane, what is is there a, I'm aware that I'm the dude moderator talking with 4 stellar women about this. I wonder about the gendered aspect of this, right? Like most of the stories I read about the creators of actually fake news, they seem to be white guys. Like, am I onto something here? Is that because those just tend to be right wingers? Like, is there something to be said here about the gender dynamic at all?
No, there absolutely is. And I would expand the gender dynamic to also encapsulate online targeted harassment of specific groups, whether that's women, whether that's immigrants, whether that's Black people, whether that's Indigenous people. And not only is that the same pattern that we see in the US, it's the same pattern that we see globally. It's the pattern that we saw before this information landed in the US, and it's a pattern we're continuing to see after the US sort of woke up to this problem. And the reason why you're probably asking is because we've been having a lot of these sort of breathless conversations about potential catastrophic scenarios in the field of disinformation in the lead up to the US election. And a lot of those catastrophic scenarios include deepfakes, which are essentially algorithm generated images or videos that that make a person look or say something that they didn't say. It's a fake image or a fake video. And it's been really interesting to watch this conversation because when Trump got ill with COVID, a lot of people began speculating about whether some of the videos were edited, whether he was using a green screen, whether there's a deep fake being used. And sort of the big focus of this technology is, well, is it being used to sort of make moderate tweaks that mislead the public about the president's health? But in reality, and we've known this for a long time, the technology of deepfakes is used to target women online. It is used to specifically enact gendered harassment and gendered abuse against women online. It's not about politics in the sense of politicians. It's about politics in the sense of who's targeted, and we can absolutely extrapolate disinformation patterns from that as well, because disinformation silences and targets vulnerable groups who are already dealing with a lot of hate online.
I just dropped a link in the chat for everybody to your news story today about deep fakes of women that makes them appear to be nude. And let me just say, I never read these stories about men that are being targeted by women. Go figure, right? So people can read your BuzzFeed story. I put it in the chat right there. All of this, I think, gets to the massive question that we have to ask every time we talk about this topic about the platforms and what are Facebook and Twitter and others doing, and how they're going far enough. So let's go around the virtual room on that question. Michelle, do you want to take that first on Facebook and Twitter? Feels to me like they've gone a mile since 2016. Like it seems like they've done a lot since 2016, but if this is a marathon, then they haven't gone very far at all.
Yeah, you just answered for me. Yeah, I do.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I'm glad we agree on it. I do think, there are efforts, there's no doubt that there are efforts, and I believe that we are in better shape than 2016, when there was still the response of kind of, rejecting the idea of the power that they had. So I think that's a positive thing. But there's so much more that needs to be done. And I think that one of the things we talk a lot to the platforms about, because we seek partnerships with them, because we really feel like they need to be supporting media literacy education. Like they've created these new communication systems that we need to educate people on, and they need to be, actively supporting it. I would say that the one thing I caution about is I don't think the whole answer is with the social media companies. I think, yes, we have to do a lot of work there. We have to look at regulation. We have to look at the size. I would like to see a lot more transparency about their algorithms and power structure and all of that. But I think it's really important to note that even if they could figure out how to remove misinformation and disinformation from their site, which they'll never be able to clean it, right? But even if they did, there's still a need to understand information and understand social media platforms and media literacy. So I kind of play, I don't know, I kind of am on the edge of like wanting them to be held responsible, obviously, wanting them to take action, but also not letting us as a society get complacent that they're going to do the work. I think obviously from my perspective, education is going to be key, because we need to teach skills. And so that's where I just want to be careful about that, is not putting the education system off the hook. Like this is multi-layered solutions that we need.
Yeah, right. Brandy, you said earlier that you're very pessimistic. I get thinking about this topic in general. Is that fair? How do you feel about the platforms and their performance?
I think they're doing a really great job. They're trying really hard, and they've been really effective. I don't think any of that. No, sorry. No. So
I was about to say, breaking news. She's changed her mind.
No, they're the worst. They only respond to negative press attention. That is what they respond to. We are seeing a month before the election, Twitter and YouTube and Facebook sort of falling over themselves to be the ones who are actually going to do something about whether it's militia groups or QAnon. Like suddenly someone tweeted this, but looked around and asked if, they were the baddies. And the answer is yes. So now I do think it's incumbent upon, all of us, the librarian in me says it's incumbent upon all of us to be, stewards of our own information and, responsible sharers of things, and to take control of what we see and what we share. Because Whitney Phillips and Claire Wardell at First Draft have this great sort of metaphor about, pollution, right? And it being a polluted information environment. And we can only depend on Exxon or whoever, the big oil companies, to do so much cleanup before we say, okay, but we also have to clean up our own backyard. And so it is going to be a dual process for sure. But the platform companies have done so little, and they will continue to do as little as humanly possible. They
Mm.
do not care about us. They care about money. They're gazillion-dollar companies. They are the most powerful companies and communication companies on the planet. And to treat them like anything else is a huge mistake.
And the problem with pollution is that everybody suffers. Obviously, the people that live closest to the factory and inhale most of it suffer the most, but everybody suffers when the environment's polluted.
Well,
Aimee, are
that's
you
a real
any? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just want to say, like, that's a really important point. We are so focused on US stuff in terms of like who is the most effective when we
Mm.
think about, minority communities here or in the US. And then when we think about places like India and other like information
Yeah.
environment and other geographies that rely on Facebook and other communication companies like Facebook for their information, we just don't cover that enough. And it's no surprise that because journalists aren't covering that enough, that's where their policies have been most lax and their content moderation has been most lax and caused the biggest harm.
It is an argument in favor of reporting and media literacy. Shine a light in those ugly corners, and sometimes these companies do react, although to your point, it's going to be the bare minimum. Aimee, are you any more optimistic than Brandy?
No, well, I think Brandy and I are right aligned, mostly because we have experience in this space, right? And we've seen them make promises. We've seen them fall short every single time. I don't know how many meetings I've sat in where they're so consumed with user experience and the bottom line to their board, and and not democracy. And it's crushing. And I think the rest of the world is hoping the US takes some kind of action, whether it's breaking them up, whether it's regulating them in some way, doing something with Section 230, because their stewardship on these platforms globally is even worse. And they don't have enough people on the ground who speak the languages where there's a big problem going on. They made a big thing about we're deplatforming every QAnon group on Facebook. And that's not true in terms of other languages in other corners of the world. So it just proliferates, and sometimes when we identify something that's a problem, they're like, thank you so much, we had no idea. And it's just like, we are the smallest of small nonprofits and you are a $1 gajillion company. Like we can't lift everything up. And as I think Michelle and Brandy both said, that it is incumbent upon us to an extent, just like, it's nice to recycle, but I'm not responsible for ExxonMobil like dumping into the ocean. So there has to be some responsibility. And so far, the US has not taken that responsibility.
I always thought, it's terrible to be compared to a tobacco company, but it's pretty bad to be compared to an oil and gas company also, and say these companies like Exxon. All right, Jane, counter argument, okay? People are complicated and they make a lot of mistakes, and they have crazy ideas in their head, and some people just want to believe in UFOs, and what's wrong with that? And if I want to believe the Democrats are cannibals, what's people are complicated. So why is this Facebook's problem if people are complicated inside? How's that for a softball? Do you like that? Just softball right to you.
That's very good. Very good. Thank you. I really want to echo what Michelle said, which is this is not a platform only issue. It is also a media literacy issue. And very frequently when we talk about media literacy, the first thing that pops into our heads is young people. But there are just as many middle-aged and older people who also need to understand how these technologies work, because these technologies are now a necessity. I think I speak for like every millennial in their family when I say I'm just the family tech support, but I do also want to take the long view of the platforms, because in 2016, there was this idea that false information is new, that platforms had no idea this was coming, and that it wasn't a preventable disaster. And it was. Activists in Myanmar tried to warn Facebook about hate speech in 2015. I'm a Ukrainian immigrant, and I've seen Russian disinformation firsthand. If you remember Flight MH17, there was an entire global, worldwide disinformation campaign around this. President Duterte in the Philippines has used the same techniques that we're seeing in the US to come to power. And it's a very similar situation in Brazil. It's a very similar situation in India. This is not a new problem. And the fact that these companies are claiming, they're throwing their hands up and are saying, oh, we had no idea this was happening, is just not true. There are people who told them this was happening and were ignored. And that needs to be at the forefront, because spoken as a person who doesn't live in the US and hasn't even lived in Canada or North America for her entire life. It's very frustrating to see the US sort of wake up to a problem and claim that they've discovered something new, when in reality, both the problem itself and a lot of the solutions already exist outside of the country. So we need only to listen to the rest of the world to understand the size of the problem and how little impact the so-called solutions these companies have implemented has actually had.
Right, right. We're going to go to questions from our viewers in a few moments. There's lots of great questions in the Q&A. I do want to go around and ask each of you what we are leaving out so far. What have I not asked so far that we need to bring up? You know, what's on my mind listening to all of you is that one of the reasons why media literacy and people's individual literacy is so important is that increasingly all of this nonsense and bile and hate is spreading in places that we can't even see and track, whether that's private Facebook groups or whether it's email forwards of memes. There's because I'm a CNN anchor, there's all this nonsense about me out there. There's this meme about me that says I was on Jeffrey Epstein's plane. It's very clever. It's like, what it says is, why was Brian Stelter on the flight logs? And I think to myself, like, how am I supposed to disprove that? Like, how am I supposed to prove that I never was on this guy's plane? And how's my daughter going to feel in 20 years when she sees that meme? And I think the answer is I have to make sure she understands media literacy, because I can't rely on Facebook or Twitter or whatever sites exist in 20 years to deal with that meme, nor do I have any rights to have it taken down, even though it's a sickening lie. I have no rights in that regard. So unless we're going to change the entire regulatory scheme of the internet, we're all going to have to be savvy news or meme consumers. So that's my thought. Let me go around to each of you for what am I leaving out? What do we not mentioned yet? And then we'll go to questions. Michelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. And I want to just thank everyone for this conversation. It's so great. And the other panel, you guys are so smart and you're doing such great work. You know, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it's almost more of a question to everyone, is that, you know, I think obviously it's so important to look at fake news and kind of the dark side of misinformation and disinformation and all the bad actors out there. But I wonder if the long-term game, instead of asking, how do I spot fake news, that it can be, how do I know reliable news? How do I see credible news? And I wonder, and I guess the question is I wonder sometimes whether we're asking the wrong questions. And I don't have an answer for that, because I do feel like the work in the misinformation and disinformation space is so important. But to me, it's about, if people truly understood journalism, if people truly understood what goes into it, would that be even that much more helpful than just being able to identify disinformation? And again, don't know the answer to it, but I just wanted to put it out there as something that I've been thinking a lot about. We do a lot of work with Reuters, and I had a wonderful conversation recently with Hazel Baker, who is the global head of user-generated content. And just speaking with her for 30 minutes about what Reuters goes through to prove whether or not content is authentic before they put it up is extraordinary. You know, and I just keep thinking, if everyone knew that this was the process, that maybe people could trust more. And so just putting it out there to all the journalists, like, can we do more journalism education? Can we, you know, and First Draft does great work, and PEN America does great work. It's just, those are that has just been something on my mind.
I don't want to hog the time, but I've been feeling this so strongly lately. I was on a Zoom with the writers of The Morning Show, this show for Apple that I helped produce a little bit. And we were talking about, how does CNN confirm someone has died? How do we know that someone has died? How do we announce someone's death? And there's all these processes at CNN and all these checks and balances. And these Hollywood writers had no idea. And why would they, right? Because we've never told them. We've never told them what we do to verify information. So I love what you just said. Let's go to Jane next.
Well, Michelle kind of took the words right out of my mouth, but I think one of the things that the pandemic, the early on lockdowns has shown us is that there is a real need for genuine news. Almost every person I've spoken with in the industry saw a huge spike in traffic as soon as the lockdowns were enacted. Some places have doubled their audiences. And that's because social media companies are not the internet, right? The entirety of the internet is not just social media. We need places to read some weird encyclopedic knowledge on, what was I looking up? I was looking up like vases in Egypt a little while ago on Wikipedia, right? Like we need news websites to tell us not just what's going on globally, but also in our neighborhood. And that need is more and more going unfulfilled and being filled by Facebook groups. So I think that Michelle is right on point there, saying not only do we need to explain how the journalistic process works, and I think a lot of people kind of forget that there's a lot of legal obligations that are tied to the journalistic process, but also to remember that journalism is in a very steep decline right now at a time when the need for it is extremely high. So supporting good sources of information is just as important as keeping social media companies to account.
Right, demand is high, supply is strained. Aimee, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things to talk about, I think, would be local news, and you could blame platforms for some of the news deserts that we have now and the shrinking of local newsrooms. But where do people get their news locally if it's not from a platform? What local sources can they trust, and which local sources can you not trust, like the pink slime sites that are designed just to get people to click or to confuse and misdirect them.
And Brandy, last but not least, what are we leaving out? What are we forgetting? What have I not asked?
Well, I'm sorry, I have to reiterate what some of the panelists have said in terms of local news. I think the biggest stories that I've told in the last, at least since the pandemic, have all sort of had a component in it of hyper-local Facebook groups. These are just the largest spreaders of misinformation and disinformation, whether it's about COVID-19 or whether it's about Antifa or the polls and what shenanigans are expected to take place there. I think that with the death of local newspapers and local news outlets, there is a vacuum of information, and people desperately want to know what's going on. And the easiest, fastest way to do that is to log on to whatever Beaver County news alerts or Klamath Falls news alerts, and you log on there. And anyone can say anything, whether it's I just saw Antifa because the president the president has said it, and then local law enforcement parroted it, and then somebody heard that, and now they think Antifa is coming to their town, and they say it on this platform. And when we say, oh, we'll get your information from someone you can trust, well, who is more trustworthy than your neighbor? And so that becomes just a really just dangerous vector for misinformation. And it is misinformation. Usually these people don't mean to spread. They're hoping to warn their neighbors. And it's very dangerous. And yet this is specifically, Facebook would point you to these specific communities as a pillar of what their community building can be and what they wanted for their Facebook groups. So it's just, and they're not making any moves to do anything with these smaller groups. So that is a real just fear of mine and what these groups are going to turn into.
We're going to go to questions from the audience, beginning with Sophia. We're going to pull up Sophia's camera and she's up first.
Hi, my name is Sophia Sakellariou. I'm a senior communication at Manhattan College. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to sit in on conversations about news with people who really share that passion. So my question is less about how to spot fake news and more so how to spot its influence on publications and news media. This past weekend, I presented my senior thesis on fake news rhetoric and its influence on kind of print publications such as the New York Times, and how they've adopted kind of like ways to battle back against the fake news rhetoric, such as their television show, The Weekly, that outlines their reporting. And I feel like if you think back 10 years ago, the fact that the Times has a show is kind of unexpected. So do you think their adaptation to these digital means are a result of the fake news sort of epidemic, or kind of necessary with this day and age, the shift towards digital media?
Who would like to go first?
I mean, I can just talk to sort of a bigger news organization like the New York Times, who has like a pretty large disinformation crew now. Whether Davy Alba is a close and Kevin Roos, and they're all sort of close with the reporters in this space, and they're taking it very seriously. NBC News has really dedicated a lot of space and importance and resources towards this problem. So I think that the larger shops got it right after 2016 and said, we don't understand anything about this space. We have to do something so that our audience isn't misinformed and isn't just tricked really by these large efforts. We have to make some move to battle those. I shouldn't leave out CNN. CNN does a great job. Doni, hello. Y'all are great.
Let's see, anybody else have thoughts or responses to Sophia?
Yeah, I would just say, Sophia, first of all, congratulations on your thesis, and you should join Namely. You seem just like our membership, so it's free, so join us. I would just say that I think that certainly, I don't work for press outlets, but certainly some of the response is not only about fake news, but certainly the political moment that we're in, but also the growth of social media platforms. So I think that it's very hard to kind of uncouple the Trump effect and the social media effect. And if Trump had not won in 2016, there would still be major changes in just in so many things within the ecosystem of news. So it's really hard to kind of separate, but I think that we just can't underestimate the changes that are in place because of these platforms that have really changed the way people consume and communicate.
And outlets like The Weekly or The Daily, all of these efforts to have, kind of more personal storytelling, they do help with transparency. And I think we're going to need that in the next 2 weeks as CNN and NBC and all these major outlets have to explain how we're going to cover the election and how we're going to know the result. And the more transparent we can be, the better. Sorry about that, Aimee, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, just about the social media influence on the media itself. I think it's incumbent upon any journalist today to be trained on the very basics of verification, to be trained on the very basics of how online communities work, and kind of the buzzwords and the amplifiers of that messaging. Because what I worry about is that the big shops, New York Times, CNN, NBC, they do have departments that are dedicated to this, but because this is seated in so many other departments, I worry that the copy editors aren't in on this, that the headline writers aren't in on this, and that there will be something missing in that food chain. So if you're a student, the thing to do is to be trained on how disinformation works, so that you aren't gamed into reporting on something you didn't intend to report.
Right. Jane, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to share maybe on a optimistic note, this new reporting technique that has really been embraced over the last few years that pulls existing information online to provide a sort of beat by beat account of what's happening. It's called open source intelligence, but it's a bit of a mouthful name and it's also a little bit pretentious. But it was pioneered by Bellingcat, which is this investigative news outlet, and is now being adapted by Aimee's organization and by Brandy's newsroom, my newsroom. And I think that the positive light is that it allows reporters to show our work in a way that makes it more trustworthy and more difficult to dispute, because essentially what it does is it allows for our readers, if they want to retrace our steps. And I think that that's a really valuable thing that's happening in newsrooms, and it's a really valuable reporting method that's being embraced in the digital age. So I think it's not all doom and gloom in terms of the approach to disinformation. Almost all doom and gloom, though.
Rays of sunlight, like the yellow on your wall. Is it Diara or Diara? You're up next. Introduce yourself.
Excellent. Yeah, you had it the second time. It's Tiara.
Great.
So I am a 2019 social engagement journalism graduate from the Newmark J School and also an employee at First Draft. And it was my first job getting hired at First Draft. And my question is, since things have changed during the pandemic and practicing journalism is a little bit harder for both students as well as emerging journalists like myself. So what advice do you have for students who are interested in entering this field? Because it is complicated and we do want to make sure we're responsibly and effectively reporting on misinformation accurately, but we don't want to, make those rookie mistakes.
Who'd like to go first? Jump in.
No, I can say something. I think that, I didn't go to journalism school. I went to library school. But a lot of what I learned in library school was how to find original sources and how to, tell complicated stories and show your work and, read until the end of something and then, report on it. And it's the opposite of fast. I'm very slow. I'm a super slow reporter. I don't get a lot of scoops, but I get a lot of exclusives. And I think that my suggestion, if I had one, I see first of all, the younger journalists are so good. Like they're so smart and everybody at First Draft. I'm 40, so they seem like sort of little babies, and I love them, and I'm in Slack with them, and they're like so smart and so fast. I think that you can't discount the skill set that comes with just being, a younger millennial or Gen Z. You guys are really good at interneting, and half of the battle is understanding the internet. So having that at your back and being able to explain that to sort of older, whiter, manlier folks, I speak internet and I also know how to report that responsibly, is really, really important. And I think that sells. I hope that sells. It sells in my newsroom. We're hiring people that are more just able to understand the internet and its workings and able to describe that really well. Then I'm really excited about it. So you're the future.
I couldn't agree more with that as a skill set. That's the advantage that younger people have in these newsrooms. Aimee, I saw you put your finger up. Did you have something to add?
No, Dara was like, oh, they're hiring. And I was like, don't even think about it, Dara.
Oh, that's what that was. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Camille has a question I'm going to read out loud. She says, are there any news sources you can recommend that are known to be generally unbiased and don't peddle misinformation? Who'd like to go first? Jane? Jane, BuzzFeed. How's that?
BuzzFeed, of course. Yeah, come read BuzzFeed. No, genuinely, come read BuzzFeed. I know how the sausage is made, so it's pretty good. It's a really difficult question because asking for a person to be unbiased is not a realistic expectation, as I think a lot of people in the industry are beginning to realize. There is no view from nowhere. So what I would say is learn how to spot details in news articles and see if those news articles sort of match up or add to the story, or are transparent with where that information is coming. Earlier, I talked about this new tradition of showing your work. And I think that adds to reliability. But in terms of sourcing, I would say follow news outlets that are not afraid to admit that they've made an error and make a loud, clear correction on that error. To me, that is the clearest sign of a trustworthy news organization. Or if that never happens, it's also the clearest sign of an organization that doesn't take accuracy seriously.
I feel really old when I say this, but I say it anyway every time I'm speaking in public. There's a reason why old-fashioned news brands are old-fashioned. There's a reason why they've been around for a while. The New York Times and NBC and ABC and CNN. We've been around for a while because we try to get it right, and we have a pretty good track record, and we have the trust of a lot of people. And there's a reason why the Washington Post has been around for a long time. And then on top of that layer of old-fashioned news brands, there are the BuzzFeeds and the Politicos that are not been around for as long, but have earned the trust of the public. And I think the bright line that we should tell people about, this really, really clear line, is between outlets that try to get it right, but might make mistakes, but we try, and we have systems in place to try, and we have checks and balances, and we have standards people, and we have bureaus around the world, and that's on one side of the line. And on the other side is sites that don't care, and don't care if it's true, and don't check, and don't follow up, and don't correct. And that line is actually pretty easy to spot, I think, when you know how to look for it. Global bureaus, corrections processes, ways to email the staff, ways to call out mistakes. Like, when you start to look, you can start to sniff some of this out. I know it's not easy enough, and we should make it easier, but there are ways to do it. Michelle, you're unmuted.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I made a point about bias. So the question isn't, with any media content, is this bias? The question is always, what is the bias? How is this biased? Because all information is biased. And I think one of the issues is we have to stop making bias mean unreliable, right? Like, there is perspective, there is POV, there is bias, there are choices made about who to interview and what to cover and who tells the story. And a news source that is clear about, like, or is transparent about some of those biases, that is a good sign, right? But I think if you're looking, there's no such thing as neutral media because of the way that it's constructed and because humans are behind it. And I think we have to be really careful about bias always being this incredibly negative term. Like, it is part of media.
Right. There's a great comment here from Rebecca that I want to read. She says, I read the New York Post to find out about silly things like the changing credit lending standards of loan sharks, not because I want their pro-Trump fawning coverage. She says she was really angry when they went to press with this Hunter Biden story when the sources were questionable at best. Quote, the New York Post wasn't always this way, and I can't be the only person in New York who doesn't like the direction they've taken. How can readers make that clear to them? And that's a really interesting perspective about, the audience ultimately is the judge. When the audience is unhappy, the audience needs to be heard, and the newsrooms need to listen. Does anybody have thoughts on that? I'm thinking about my recent experience with the New York Post. They write an item about me in page 6 that said I was with my kids at a diner, and I was with my wife, but not my kids. And I didn't bother to tell New York Post. I didn't bother to correct it because I was like, oh, well, it's the New York Post. Like, it's a gossip column. What am I going to do? But I did find it amusing. Whenever you're the subject of news coverage, it is amusing to see when people get it wrong. Anybody have thoughts on the New York? Sorry, from Rebecca?
Well, I would just say, I bet you guys, the journalists here, are going to hate me, but you got to tweet at them. You got to be heard. You got to send them letters.
I should have called out the Post. You're right.
Yeah, like, you tweet at them. I mean, let's be honest. And someone said this about the social media platforms. They respond to negativity way more than they respond to positivity, which actually is it's a terrible fact, right? But make yourself heard, and if people that feel the same way, make yourself heard. I think that is one thing that there is power in these social media platforms to be heard. And so, communicate with them.
Hi there. Sorry
There
about
she
that
is.
little disruption. My name's Lauren Lee. I am a student wanting to study and pursue film. Thank you all for being here tonight. This has been a really incredible panel so far. My question kind of revolves around social media. I've personally noticed a really big role of social media influencers and activists kind of as like people's main source of information. A lot of me and my friends follow these influencers and activists, and they are kind of the first person that some of us go to see updated information on what is happening. Maybe they are a queer activist reporting on what's happening in the LGBTQ community. And so these big profile people are kind of becoming almost a news source that a lot of younger people specifically look to, and they might go to them before they go to a CNN or an NBC. But obviously these are just people, and so they are not a credible news network. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, we're talking about fake news, how do we kind of navigate this, because there's essentially no filter like for these people, and they are kind of becoming their own news network if they have a big enough platform. So I'm just curious what you think their role in fake news is.
I don't know about their role in fake news, but I do know that when we were looking for information sources to try and train and explain how how social media works and how things wind up in the newsfeed, we definitely wanted to talk to community groups, to activist groups, and we are in touch with a group who is interested in looking at disinformation that's targeting Black and Latinx communities. And so, we see them, especially because newspapers or newsrooms are no longer the only gatekeepers that people have access to. So we take those people and those groups very seriously in terms of being good sources of information that people can rely on and have, as you mentioned, and have thousands and thousands of followers. Now, how do you sort the good from the bad? I think that that's up to everybody's own looking through their profiles, looking through their public statements, looking through their funding sources, being really judicious with who you choose to follow and why. And maybe it's worth being with a slightly more organized group than a disorganized group, something that has a bit of a track record, something that can be verified for those purposes. But that's how First Draft is trying to see that the people, it's not just newsrooms anymore who we have to communicate with, it's other gatekeepers, and clergy, librarians, those types of people also are helpful to distribute good information.
I think I just add, that was great, Aimee. I just add that, this is where media literacy education from the earliest ages to the, through life is so important, because this is where the distinction between being a source of information and being journalism is different. It's different. It's not the same thing. And we need to understand all of those different forms of information. And I would say we also need the YouTubers and the TikTokers to take real responsibility for the roles that they do play in spreading information and give them training, just like Aimee, is training journalists. Like, these YouTubers have incredible influence, and these TikTokers have incredible influence. And so we need to train them and let them see what their responsibility is. But I think that's the difficulty of also the way that information is presented, that on these feeds, you can't, a blog post looks the same as an investigative journalism piece of Washington Post, like when you're moving through your feed. And that's why it's so important for us to really be digging into this in schools and with education, because people really need those skills to decipher between different types of information.
Mm.
I just want to add really quickly that first of all, Brandy can probably spend a whole other panel talking about the danger of relying on influencers only for information. But I think that's something that the anti-police brutality protests have shown, is that there's a real need to fill an informational niche for communities that are traditionally undercovered by media or that have lost their or news deserts, as we were talking about earlier. So I think that it's great that people are filling that niche, but you do need to be careful in terms of relying on influencers for information solely. The one thing that I wanted to add is newsrooms should be encouraged to experiment with social media. Part of the reason why influencers are a go-to for a lot of people is because newsrooms don't have don't have TikTok channels, don't use Instagram stories effectively, sort of think that like throwing up a story on Facebook is like the only social media promotion that they need. So if you ever do get to the newsroom, or if you sort of people in our industry really need to think through addressing the need that influencers are currently addressing already.
Right? Why are they influential? Right? Why are they influencers? What are they doing right that we can learn from? Our final question is from Angela.
With a lot of future journalists coming into a news world that has a fake news issue, what is some advice you can give in fact check and how we can fact check fake news?
So I think that there's two lanes. I think that fact checkers are incredibly important, and I do not fact check. So what I sort of, again, like our process is to explain how fake news operates and how, junk news websites or false news websites or far right influencers, how they operate, how they profit, and how they package what they're trying to sell you and how it gets to you. So I think that just documenting that sort of pipeline and really explaining why you got some piece of false news or false information is that's what I try to do. And I think that that's people really seem to like it. In terms, like, fact checks can be a little like, no, it's not actually this, but here's what it is. And I think that you have the real opportunity as a journalist to tell sort of juicy stories about who are the people trying to bring you this stuff and why are they bringing it to you and who benefits from, the president on down. So it's really, there's a lot of opportunity, and there are more stories than I can possibly get to. So there's a real opportunity for people for students like you to do this work now. So that is one thing, and the other opportunity in terms of like ways to sort of cover this beat that aren't just fact checking are to focus on the victims of this misinformation and disinformation. Like, who are the people who profit? Yes, but who are the people who suffer? Who are the people that are getting incorrect COVID-19 advice from anti-vaxxers? And what impact is that having? And that has a much larger impact, I think, than single fact checking can ever do, because stories and narratives stick in people's minds. And if you explain who's profiting and who's hurting from this bad information, I think that that has a real sticky quality to a story that really stays with people and lingers long past a specific news source, where people can ask themselves, wait a minute, is somebody profiting off of this information, whatever the news source may be?
Right. Aimee, anything to add on what First Draft can do to help?
Yeah, I added into the comments our 14-day free SMS course. It'll give you just a primer on what we're talking about when we say verification. And if you want more, we have more. But it's in Spanish and in English. And a lot like what Jane says is to take people through those 5 critical steps of verification. It's basically the digital version of who, what, when, where, why, how. And if you can't answer every one of those questions, you tell the readers, we tried to find who took this photo, we can't find it. And sometimes that might be an opportunity too for readers to send in their comments. We see that sometimes with Henk Van Ness, who's an expert in this space, who kind of crowdsources, where was this taken? And they were able to isolate it. I think one of the things was in Amsterdam. So those things can be a great way to engage an audience and also to learn more about how verification works. But it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Jane?
Yeah, I just want to definitely echo what everybody else has said. Don't learn to fact check, learn to investigate, and the facts will come. And if you do want to learn to investigate, the course that Aimee dropped is really, really great. I also really want to plug the verification handbook, which was edited by my colleague Craig Silverman, that Brandy and I both contributed to. which shows some very concrete step-by-step instructions of how we conduct our investigations, the tools that we use, and how to use those tools. So all of these types of resources are out there. I'll also just give another shout out to Bellingcat, which are very good at showing their work. Look for those resources, look at how these investigations are done, really sink your teeth into, okay, they did a reverse image search. What search engine did they use the reverse image search on to get to that result? Sort of start thinking like a computer a little bit. And then you will learn the basics of verification, but also the basics of online investigations, which are so in demand right now.
Right, they absolutely are. So that is our final question from the audience. I just want to wrap up by asking everybody, because one of the ideas here for our panel and one of the mentions in the description was, how should you be your own media critic? How can you be your own discerning consumer of news? So let's go around for about a minute each for each panelist to give a final thought from that perspective. And any other sites or handbooks, or I'm glad Jane's putting the URL in there in the chat, any other resources we can recommend to the audience?
You have to use your inquiry muscles. So that's just simply asking questions, asking questions, asking questions with whatever media you interact with, and think about things like, why is the story being told and what is missing from the story that I should know? I think Brandy said something about who's harmed and who benefits from it. These are all really important questions to ask. And I think that, you know, if you can slow down in these systems, in these social media platforms that want us to speed up, that is really helpful. To not share if you haven't verified, it's not worth the share. To not start acting like an expert just because you read a couple of headlines. Just really be conscious of our media consumption and think about what place you want to have in the media ecosystem that will impact the way you create media. But most importantly, a media literate person is always asking questions.
Brandy, let's go next.
Yeah, I think I say a lot that the internet is where nuance goes to die. And I think that what I always appreciate and what I look for in news sources is that nuance. Is, you know, I look for a story that tells me, where a journalist tells me what they don't know as well as what they know. I look for stories that tell me facts that might make me uncomfortable. It might challenge my worldview. I look for, like, there was a story about Governor Whitmer in Michigan and how a group of men had a kidnapping plot foiled, and they're now in prison awaiting being charged for this crime. But in our story, you know, it was sticky. It was complicated. Some of the men were, you know, oath keepers and 3%ers, and there was one of the men was like a boogaloo type who had an anarchist flag, and so there were sort of competing narratives. It wasn't cut and dry. But then on some of the far right blogs, you got, this guy was an anarchist. Like, if something fits that cleanly into your worldview, I think that you need to question the source that's giving you this information. So yeah, look for the nuance, I guess.
Jane, how about you? And then Aimee.
Yeah, you know, I think that outside of the mechanics of verification, and outside of the deep anxiety and dread and depression that we're all confessing to our therapists right now, or our friends, it's also okay to be excited to learn new things. The verification community is extremely open, and I promise you that if anybody reaches out to any person on this panel, we're going to make the time to answer and respond and send you resources and look at what you found. A lot of the things that young reporters or young people in this field bring me are cool, you know, and a lot of online investigations are cool. A lot of like things you can do with the internet are honestly pretty gnarly, but like in a good way. I realize I was an old person using a word. So like, take a deep breath. It's okay to not be anxious all the time. It's okay to be excited to learn about something and dive into a rabbit hole and investigate it. And I think that that's, I hope that that stays with people.
Yeah, as much as it is a dark, gloomy environment sometimes, and there's this information war raging, we get to be part of the solution. And, for the Center for Communication, for young people watching, for students of any age watching, there's so much growth potential in this space. I know the center oftentimes talks about where's the growth in this industry? Where's the growth in this space? All over the place, whether it is pure fact checking of a presidential lie, or whether it is who is the victim of a disinformation campaign, the way Brandy was talking about, who are the victims, who are the perpetrators of this stuff, or whether it's the impact of deep fakes, as you were reading about today, Jane. There's all the growth area here is everywhere in terms of spotting fake news and exploding these lies. And I feel like increasingly big newsrooms and small newsrooms are going to be in this verification job, this curation job. So it's like you're going to come in from the cold and you have no idea what's true. And inside these hopefully accurate newsroom bubbles, we can tell you what's been verified and what's been debunked. And that's an incredibly exciting job to have, and incredibly exciting to be able to be a part of that solution to the problem. So Aimee, that's just my take. What's your way to wrap us up here tonight?
Well, I'm going to suggest something really radical in that the platforms, just among destroying society, they have also destroyed society's ability to understand what is important, because everything on your Facebook feed is of equal importance, right? So I would challenge everybody on the call to look at the homepages of news sites and read widely on there and really compare. That's how I do my morning warm-ups. I go to the New York Times and I'm like, that's weird. They played that above the fold. Why would they do that? And then go to Breitbart and be like, oh my God, it's nowhere on their homepage. They're actually prioritizing this thing today. So it's fascinating to see how newsrooms play their news, and we lose that A1 experience that I grew up with, but that this generation isn't growing up with. So I really encourage you. I realize most people find their way to a website through a link to an article, but go to the homepages, see how they play the news, and you'll really get a sense of how that the leanings of that particular newsroom as well.
Right. That's the best way to be your own media critic, is to consume everything, have a diverse diet, be voracious, and try to figure out what it all means, and then rely on the folks on this panel to help you to know those answers. I want to thank everybody for participating tonight, and thank everybody watching as well. Remember, the Center for Communication is here all the time and needs your support. You can donate at centerforcommunication.org/donate and watch the programming on Facebook, on YouTube, one of the actual benefits of the platforms that we have been talking about tonight. Thank you, everybody. Celebrate National Media Literacy Week next week, medialiteracy.us, and join the center for future programming here on the web as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.